Happy Mother's Day, and welcome to a special Mother's Day sermon from those of us here at the Mayfair Church of Christ. If you've been joining us throughout the last few weeks, we concluded our Resurrected Life sermon series last week. Again, we'll have a special Mother's Day sermon today. And then if Lauren and I are not having a baby next Sunday, we will jump into a new sermon series next week. If, as there is a high chance, we are having a baby next week, then Jake Dobrins will step in to lead a couple of sermons for us in the meantime. But again, we want to be sure and say to all our mothers and grandmothers out there today, Happy Mother's Day, and thanks for joining us. Part of the Creator always ends up in the created. It's a natural part of the creative process, all the way from our world's most famous works of art down to the time that you opened up the Ninja Turtle coloring book and grabbed a box of crayons. The finished work of art tells something about you. Let's take the coloring book example for a moment. You picked the coloring book. You then selected a page out of that coloring book to color. So already your choices are shining through in this moment, and we haven't even picked up a crayon yet. Then we start talking about mediums. Do you prefer crayons? Do you like markers? Or are you a colored pencil person? And then once you actually put color to the paper, the process of how you color that image says something about you. Do you outline the pieces before you color them in, or you just go for it? Do you like to add shading or not? And then this is the big question, the one that I think might divide all coloring groups into two. Do you like to color things as they naturally appear, or do you like to draw purple grass and a green sky, so to speak? Whatever the end product is of that coloring page, it says something about you. Part of the Creator always ends up in the created. I mentioned earlier that this same truth applies even to our world's most famous works of art. Take this one of the most famous paintings in history, Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. Now, you could go down all kinds of rabbit holes in the painting of The Last Supper and look at all sorts of different conspiracy theories and things that may or may not be in there. But there's one that's a little less conspiracy-based that I want to talk about today. Did you know that in addition to all of the things that Leonardo da Vinci did, he also liked to compose music? Now, there's not a lot of his music available left to us in the world today, but some experts have said that if you draw a musical staff across the table in Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, and you use the pieces of bread as musical notes, that it forms a pretty impressive line of music. Now, is this coincidence? Entirely possible. Or could something about Leonardo da Vinci be showing forth in his painting? Might he have been trying to tell us a little-known fact about himself? Or take this one. This is Van Gogh's Cafe Terrace at Night. At first glance, this is just a beautiful cafe scene, right? Tables outside, people enjoying a nice drink or a meal. But take a closer look. There are exactly 12 people seated at these tables, and there is one waiter person standing in the middle who just so happens to be wearing a long robe and have long hair. Some people might ask, is this Van Gogh's version of The Last Supper? Now, Van Gogh has never gone on record as saying anything religious about this painting. However, some say that you can find crosses hidden all throughout this painting, including one directly above the head of the person who might be the Jesus figure or the waiter at the cafe. We know that Van Gogh's father was a minister, and in addition to that and these other kind of conspiracies in this painting, we have this excerpt from a letter that Van Gogh wrote to his brother. This doesn't stop me having a terrible need for, dare I say the word, religion. So I go outside at night to paint the stars, and I always dream a painting like that with a group of living figures of the pals. Is that coincidence? Possibly. Or are we seeing visible evidence of the pull on Van Gogh's heart, the pull of Jesus on the heart of the artist? Many times in their work, artists reveal pieces of their true selves. Part of the identity of the creator appears in the created. In the first chapter of Genesis, a text that we referred to last week, Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27, we find a revelation that shapes our lives to this day, and one that, again, we talked briefly about last week that we'll dive into a little deeper here. Genesis 1:27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Created in the image of God, male and female. Much has been made throughout the years about the differences between males and females, and rightfully so. Men and women approach situations very differently. They act differently and speak differently and think differently. However, despite all of those differences, the truth that we find in this passage is that each of us, no matter how different, displays the image of the Creator God. And although we use male pronouns to talk about God, when we start to look at God's defining qualities and those traits that are reflected in us, I think we find that our mothers are the manifestation of some of the best parts of God. Today we're going to look at four different attributes displayed in mothers that are also present in God himself. Number one, in our mothers, we see unconditional love. A mother's love is legendary. We have the phrase, a face only a mother could love, for a reason. I've had the opportunity throughout my life to coach a few different sports at various different ages, from middle school basketball all the way up to high school baseball. And there's one phenomenon that always rings true. On every team, there is at least one or two mothers who see their child very differently than the coach does. We always end up in these settings where a mother will ask to have a meeting with the coach, sit down, and bemoan the fact that her child is not playing more than he is. And in these moments, I always tend to think to myself, is she seeing the same kid that I'm seeing every day? And the answer to that question is no. She and I do not see the same child. And that is because a mother is full of an unconditional love. Our mothers love us against all odds. They come by it naturally, though. They are made in the image of God, a God who against all logic and reason loves us unconditionally, with a passion that would put even the craziest mom to shame. 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, we hear this description of God. Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. In our mothers, we see unconditional love because we have a God of unconditional love. Number two, in our mothers, we see unending patience. In Exodus chapter 34, after Moses has the second version of the Ten Commandments, the Lord passes by Moses and reveals something about himself. And we find this in Exodus 34, beginning in verse 6. Exodus 34 and verse 6. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Over the last year, my daughter, who is now about to be 2, has learned very well now to eat with utensils. It did not start out that way, though. And there's this famous moment in our family in which we sat Sutton down in her high chair and we fed her avocados. We gave her a little fork. She was learning to try to use the utensil, but within a matter of minutes, the utensil was on the floor, and the avocados now looked like green finger paint, and they were everywhere. And if you could have seen the look on my face, it probably looked something just disgusted like this, as she took her hands and mashed the avocados and spread them around, and every now and then eventually put a piece of it in her mouth to eat. I remember feeling so stressed out in this moment. I just saw avocado all over her, all over the chair. I started thinking about how we were going to clean this. What are we going to do? And I look across the table at my wife, who is watching Sutton just spread these avocados everywhere, and she has such a peaceful, happy look on her face, and she looks at me and says something like, "Oh, look, she's learning." Long after everyone else has given up and moved on, a mother's patience persists. Again, we use male pronouns to describe God, although God does not have merely a human form. But there is one piece of evidence that proves to me that God is not simply male. Have you ever tried to read the book of Judges? If you've tried to read the book of Judges through from beginning to end, it almost gets annoying how repetitive it is. God's people do something wrong and they find themselves in a bad situation. They cry out to God for forgiveness and for rescue, and God sends a rescuer and then has this talk with them where he says, "Okay, now you have to act better. Walk straight." And God's people say, "Yes, thank you for rescuing us. We will do it." And then the next chapter starts, and God's people do something dumb, and they find themselves in captivity, and they cry out to God for deliverance, and God delivers them. And he says, "Okay, this time walk straight." And they say, "We will." And it happens again and again and again. And there is no mere mortal man on the face of this planet that I've ever met that would be that patient with his children. Our mothers can be patient because they reflect the image of a patient God. Number 3, in our mothers, we see unparalleled protection. I'm going to read the same verse that we just read in Exodus 34, but there's one part that comes after that revelation that I stopped last time that I will read this time. Exodus 34, again beginning in verse 6. "And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished." Read from this passage in Psalm chapter 18. Listen to the description of how God answers a cry from his child. Psalm chapter 18, beginning in verse 1. "I love you, Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I called to the Lord who is worthy of praise, and I have been saved from my enemies. The cords of death entangled me. The torrents of destruction overwhelmed me. The cords of the grave coiled around me. The snares of death confronted me. And in my distress I called to the Lord. I cried to my God for help. From his temple he heard my voice. My cry came before him into his ears. The earth trembled and quaked, and the foundations of the mountains shook. They trembled because he was angry. Smoke rose from his nostrils. Consuming fire came from his mouth. Burning coals blazed out of it. He parted the heavens and came down. Dark clouds were under his feet. He mounted the cherubim and flew. He soared on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, and the dark rain clouds of the sky. Out of the brightness of his presence, clouds advanced, with hailstones and bolts of lightning. The Lord thundered from heaven, the voice of the Most High resounded. He shot his arrows and scattered the enemy. With great bolts of lightning he routed them. The valleys of the sea were exposed, and the foundations of the earth laid bare. At your rebuke, Lord, at the blast of breath from your nostrils. And then in verse 16, he reached down from on high and took hold of me. He drew me out of deep waters. The psalmist here has this really, really great description of God answering his call for help. We have this description of God coming down out of heaven and breathing fire from nostrils. And I can tell you that I have seen that look on the face of a mother before, haven't you? I have seen that look from my own mother before. I remember one time I had just turned 16, just gotten that coveted driver's license, and convinced my mother to let me drive to basketball practice. Now, the problem with me driving to basketball practice was that I actually had to get on the highway and drive on a 4-lane, 70-mile-per-hour road to get to basketball practice, and so she was a little nervous about that. But I convinced her to let me go on one condition, that once I got to basketball practice, I would immediately text her and let her know that I had arrived safely. Well, I got to basketball practice, jumped out of the car, ran in. I was a few minutes late, and they were already beginning to side up teams to scrimmage. So I threw on my basketball shoes and jumped in, and forgot one really important part of that agreement. We started up and down, we played a couple of points, and all of a sudden I felt the burning sensation on the back of my head, and something told me to turn around. And I turned and looked, and there, like a scene out of a horror movie, was my mother standing on the court underneath the basket at the other end, arms crossed, boring a hole through the back of my head. Everybody looked at me and said, "Do you know her?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm going to need a sub. I need a minute." And I walked over to her, and we had this conversation, and I saw that look on her face. And that look came from fear that I was in trouble, fear that I had been hurt, fear that I had not made it safely to basketball practice. Now, that fear turned into other things directed at me in that moment later, but my mother was fiercely protective of me in that moment. We find fierce protection in our mothers because we find fierce protection in our God. And finally, number 4, in our mothers we find unbridled joy. There is no one more happy for you when you succeed than your mother. Time after time, as famous athletes find themselves on camera on the sidelines, they look in the camera, they make eye contact, and the first thing they say is, "Hi, Mom." And the reason that they say, "Hi, Mom," is because for every dad that might be sitting at home watching this transpire saying, "That's my boy," there is a mom who is trying not to run circles around the living room and scream out loud at the fact that her child is there. In our mothers, we find unbridled joy. Listen to a passage from the prophet Zephaniah in Zephaniah chapter 3 and verse 17. "The Lord your God is with you, the mighty warrior who saves. He will take great delight in you. In his love he will no longer rebuke you, but will rejoice over you with singing." We find unbridled joy in our mothers because they reflect the image of a God who is overjoyed for us. Our mothers are a gift from God. They are representative of the kind of loving, patient, protective, and joyful God that created us. Reflect today on the mother figures in our lives. They might be your birth mother. They might be your adoptive mother. They might not even be related to you at all. But I guarantee that if you are hearing this message, there is someone in your life who has played that role for you. Someone who has been an example of God's love and protection for you. And maybe there's more than one. Thank those ladies for their example of love and grace that they have been, and thank God that part of the Creator always ends up in the created.